Chapter 87 Huge Vine Rising. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Seeing the heavy guard presence, Rog asked, Dalton, how does that crane system you mentioned work? Hold on a sec, it's right over there. Dalton pointed towards the side of the mountain. Rog and the others looked up. A metal pod, the size of a small house, hung suspended in the air, for heavy chains secured the gondola. So that's how it works. Must be a pulley system at the summit to lower the pod, Rog observed. The house-sized pod descended and slowly touched down on the platform. Soldiers unloaded empty wine barrels and crates, supplies that had already been used up. Then, soldiers near the platform brought over cargo from several carriages. The goods included wine, meat, fruits, vegetables, coal, and cloth, guarded by numerous soldiers. The pod transport crew opened the wine barrels and food crates for inspection. After the goods were moved near the platform, they were thoroughly checked for stowaways and any signs of poison. Once the officer in charge was satisfied, the supplies were officially loaded into the pod. The officer then used a field phone to signal the operator at the top of the mountain. The pod began its ascent, pulled upwards by the four thick iron chains. Rog, Dalton, Sanji, and the others watched from a distance. They used this to haul supplies up. Guess personnel go up and down the same way, Rog said. Perfect. I've got it. We hide among the cargo and hitch a ride up, Usopp exclaimed, his eyes lighting up. Give me a break. Did you see how many times they checked those goods? Zoro countered. Is there no other way? Sanji asked, taking a drag from his cigarette. Luffy, ever restless, declared, we could just climb. You haven't thought this through, have you? Usopp snapped. Rog glanced at Luffy, then back at Iron Barrel Mountain. Climb. Rog fell into thought. The situation was critical. King Wapple's army was strong. They needed to capture or eliminate him as quickly as possible. Suddenly, an idea sparked in Rog's mind, a plan that might just work. Guys, I think I've got something. We go to the top of the mountain together. I'm going to send everyone to the heavens on vines, Rog announced. Ride a vine to heaven? The others were stunned. I can use my plant powers to grow vines thousands of feet long. But it'll take a lot of time and energy, so we need to prepare and strike at the right moment, Rog explained. Also, if the vines get that high, the enemy will try to cut us off, so we need to divert their attention, Rog emphasized. If that's the plan, we all need to work together, Dalton said. Sounds wild, Sanji commented. Let's do it, Zoro agreed eagerly. Luffy and Usopp were equally excited, cheering. Going to the sky on a giant vine will be awesome. Luffy shouted. This will be so cool. Usopp's eyes were filled with anticipation. After a moment's thought, Rog added, this mountain is huge, and even climbing vines will be exhausting. So, let's eat and drink first, then head up. All right. Everyone agreed enthusiastically. Rog and Dalton left ahead of the others. After returning to the massive basement they had discovered earlier, they finalized their strategy. The next day dawned with heavy snow still falling. Tsugu Kingdom remained heavily guarded, especially the central mountain peak. Over 1,000 of King Wapple's elite troops were stationed in fortified positions, equipped with cannons, machine guns, and motorized cavalry on standby. Under these conditions, Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy, and Dalton led their forces towards the central mountain. This is it. According to plan, my troops will feint an attack at the base of the mountain to draw their attention. Others will launch diversionary attacks in different areas. The 5 of us will ascend the mountain together, Dalton explained. Got it. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy rode in a carriage. The 4 got out of the carriage and started walking. Dalton also dismounted. Complete the mission, Dalton instructed his lieutenant. We swear to distract the enemy. We guarantee they'll be focused on us at the mountain's base, the lieutenant assured. Dalton, Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy watched as the 200-man team charged forward. Okay, time for us to move, Rog said. Dalton watched his men bravely advance, then turned and headed towards their pre-selected location together. Everyone went to the rear of the central mountain. On the east side, the 5 of them stood in the snow, and Rog buried a vine seed in the ground beneath the snow. The seed, about the size of a pigeon egg, had been genetically modified by Rog. Planting wasn't enough. Rog focused all his plant powers. A green light began to emanate from him. Dazzling green light radiated from Rog's hands. He pressed his hands down to bury the seed. Immediately, the seed broke through the earth and began to grow rapidly. The seed quickly sprouted into vines as thick as buckets. Numerous leaves grew alongside the main stem. "Quick, get on!" Rog commanded. Dalton, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy all climbed onto the enormous vines. Rog also hopped on. The vines grew rapidly, and Rog continued to use his plant powers to maintain their growth. "This is awesome!" Luffy cheered. "Not bad," Zoro agreed. "It's moving fast," Sanji remarked. "It's unbelievable, but not surprising considering you're doing it," Dalton said. "Hang on tight, everyone, we're accelerating." Rog maintained a steady focus, pouring energy into the plant fruit with both hands. The huge vines continued to grow, and the temperature dropped as they ascended. Chapter 88 The Movement of the Drum King #039, S Army. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Rog used his powers to make the giant vines climb the 5,000-meter mountain. "Getting kind of chilly, don't you think?" Zoro commented. As the vines rose, everyone noticed the temperature dropping. "Yep, definitely getting windy and snowy," Rog confirmed. They had already ascended over 1,000 meters, yet the wind and snow just kept getting worse. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy, and Dalton continued their ascent on the vines. Meanwhile, at the base of the central peak, Dalton's rebels were clashing with the king's forces. "Spread out!" shouted a rebel officer on horseback. The 200 rebels quickly dispersed. Dalton's strategy was to harass the enemy and prevent them from interfering when the vines reached their full height. This tactic tied up a significant number of the king's soldiers. However, they only managed to distract a few hundred of the elite guards stationed at the central peak, leaving nearly 1,000 to protect the base. These guards knew that failing to protect Wapol at the summit meant certain death. Elsewhere in the Drum Kingdom, Dalton's resistance launched coordinated attacks on the king's army, in the coastal urban area of Drum Country. What was that? An explosion? What's going on? Heard pirates teamed up with Dalton's rebels recently. Think they're behind this, that the townspeople poured into the streets, bewildered. Smoke billowed from various points within the city. Dalton's operatives were ambushing the king's army guard posts. The security force in the urban area was less skilled than Jess's mobile army. Still, their large numbers made them a considerable threat. The king's army quickly mobilized to hunt down Dalton's men within the city. Cavalry and infantry units patrolled the streets. Cavalry officers galloped to various locations. Commander Jess has ordered an immediate and thorough search of the city. Every house and public space. Soldiers burst into homes, shops, and bars, conducting aggressive searches. The people seethed with resentment but dared not voice it. Wapol and his army had absolute power in Drumland. Any hint of dissent was punishable by death. He tightly controlled the people's lives and the economy. Wapol was practically a god in the Drum Kingdom, yet, the people harbored deep-seated hatred for him, fueling Dalton's resistance. Some wondered if today marked the start of a revolution to overthrow Wapol. The resistance was unusually active. Wapol's army was on full alert. Some ordinary citizens were even considering joining the fight, but the decisive factor would be whether Dalton could truly shake things up. Jess was at a command post near the industrial area, fielding calls. The phone lines were ringing off the hook. "Commander, we're under attack." "Commander, Dalton's rebels are hitting us hard." "Commander, they're attacking the supply depot." That the emergency reports were endless. Jess slammed his fist on the table, enraged. "Dalton and those pirates have lost it." That his outburst terrified the surrounding officers. Even when things went wrong, Commander Jess rarely got this angry. This time, he was furious. As the commander of the king's army, his ongoing battle with Dalton, now complicated by pirates, was already a constant headache, but Jess's biggest fear was Wapol's safety. After delegating most of the reports to his officers, Jess personally checked on the defenses around the central peak. "The central peak is under attack too." he asked, shocked. Yes, Commander. Dalton's men attacked the central mountain, but we repelled them, the voice on the other end reported. Still worried, Jess said, hold the line. I'm sending reinforcements. Yes, sir. The call ended. Jess thought for a moment, then ordered, deploy the hot air balloon troops to the central mountain immediately. He then used the phone bug to contact the troops stationed at the peak. Hello, this is Jess, he said into the receiver. Commander, what are your orders? Came the reply. You're aware of the situation at the base of the mountain. I need you to prepare for battle. His Majesty Wapple's safety is paramount, Jess instructed. Understood, Commander, the soldier replied. Jess hung up. He stood up from his seat. Get ready. I'm leading the cavalry to reinforce the central peak. Cavalry and assault troops, move out. We'll be there quickly. The officers snapped to attention. Yes, Commander. Jess led his army toward the central mountain. Over 1,000 elite cavalry troops and hundreds of carriages carrying special forces set off. Meanwhile, hot air balloons began rising all over Drum Country. Wapple and Jess had imported a large number of hot air balloons from an arms dealer in Drexus for troop transport. These house-sized balloons could carry commandos, 2 cannons, and several machine guns. As Rog and his crew rapidly ascended on the giant vines, Usopp, Nami, and Vivi were racing towards the east side of the central mountain. From there, they could watch the vines climb. Wow, that's incredible, Usopp said, awestruck by the sight of the growing vines. They had already reached a height of about 3,000 meters, that left another 2,000 meters to the summit. Snow clouds surrounded the vines, obscuring the view. I hope they're okay, Vivi said worriedly. G.A. Karu squawked in agreement, running alongside her. Don't worry, Rog and Sanji will make it to the top, Nami said confidently. Even with just 5 of them, Rog and the others were capable of anything. Chapter 89 Rushing to the Peak. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Just then, Jess's army showed up, riding his warhorse. Jess saw Dalton's forces locked in a fierce fight with the king's troops guarding the central mountain. Move in for support. Jess ordered. Yes, sir. Several officers led hundreds of cavalry to clear out Dalton's men, but something felt off to Jess. Something's not right here. The rest of you, follow me and scout around the central peak, Jess ordered. Jess led the remaining cavalry and a large wagon to investigate the central mountain. He and his troops reached the east side of the peak. Jess reined in his horse, surprised by what he saw. An enormous vine, seemingly stretching to the sky, grew up the side of the mountain. What the hell is that? Jess said, stunned. His troops were equally shocked. The central mountain was already a towering 16,000-foot peak. Now, this massive vine had reached about 13,000 feet. Jess immediately understood the situation. That's it. They're trying to get Chang's giant vine to the top to assassinate King Wapple. Jess quickly gave orders. Wagon crews, prepare the artillery. We're blasting those vines. The crews scrambled to get the cannons ready, pulling them out of the wagons and loading them quickly. Most of the artillery was direct-fire cannons designed for aiming. The barrels were long, about 6 feet, but only as thick as a man's arm. Each had a precision sight. Made in Drexus was engraved on the side of each one. These cannons were made for precision, designed to pierce armor and hit targets dead on. Over 100 cannons pointed their muzzles at the giant vine. Ready to fire, barked the artillery commander. The cannons unleashed a barrage of powerful shells. Cannonballs slammed into the giant vine. The vine exploded. At the 13,000-foot mark, Rog and the others felt the ground tremble. What's going on? Sanji asked. The entire vine was shaking violently. Rog looked down and saw the king's army gathering below. We've been spotted, Rog said. Here they come, Zoro said. Luffy kept shouting, hey, look. Fireworks down there. Dalton's face was grim. This is bad. They've got artillery. On the ground, the artillery crews reloaded and fired again. The giant vine swayed violently, as if it might collapse. Hang on, everyone. I'm putting everything I've got into getting this vine to the top. Rog focused his fruit abilities. his hands glowing with a brighter green light. Even as he exhausted himself, the vine continued to grow rapidly. Jess saw the base of the vine was under strain. Full fire on the base of that thing, that the cannons unleashed a fierce bombardment on the base of the giant vine. The entire structure shook violently. Keep firing. Now, Jess roared. The vine was taking damage, the high altitude brought violent wind and snow, and the shelling added to the instability. The giant vine was reaching its breaking point. Rog and his crew were getting closer to the top. Almost there. Less than 300 feet to go. Rog was exhausted. Finally, the vine reached the summit of the central mountain, but at that moment, it began to give way. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy, and Dalton leaped. They landed on the mountaintop. The giant vine collapsed behind them. The five stood in the snow, battered by the wind. The top of the mountain was flat. It really was like an iron barrel, with a platform at the top. Rog was completely drained. He'd exerted himself more than anyone else, using his plant fruit ability to grow the vine to over 16,000 feet had taken everything out of him. Phew. I'm beat. You guys okay? Rog looked up and saw a large group of heavily armed enemies ahead. A magnificent palace made of gold stood in the center, untouched by the ice and snow. Guess the enemy can't get in. Looks like they rolled out the welcome wagon, Rog said. Zoro had already unsheathed his 3 swords. You're tired. Leave this to us, Zoro said. Rog smiled and didn't say anything. Dalton hefted a massive iron halberd from his back, a 9-foot weapon he'd carry into battle. Luffy jumped up and down, shouting, "We made it to the top." Sanji pulled out a den mushi. "Miss Vivi, we're at the top." "Don't worry," Sanji said happily. "That's great." Vivi's voice came back. "You made it. Don't worry about us. Captain Usopp and I are handling the thousands of troops down here. Go take care of Wapol." Usopp's voice followed. Sanji said to the den mushi, "Okay, we'll give you some good news." "I trust you." Nami's voice rang out. "Miss Nami, you can count on me," Sanji said. "But bring back some of Wapol's treasure, okay?" Nami's voice said again. "No problem." Sanji's face was still full of love. Roger, though exhausted, took out a cactus. At this crucial moment, Rog activated his plant fruit ability. The cactus transformed into power armor, covering Rog's body like a mass of muscle. Though drained, he had to fight to the finish. "Still got a decent number of enemies," Sanji said. Hundreds of Wapol's elite guards were gathered ahead. They were all in knight armor, wielding cannons, machine guns, giant axes, spears, and other weapons. "Let's go, Wapol's lackeys," Dalton said. Chapter 90: The Fierce Battle at the Top of the Mountain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. About half of Wapol's elite personal guard is concentrated here. Unlike the guards atop the other peaks, these guys are Wapol's absolute best. The soldiers were decked out in armor and packing some serious heat. They were ready to throw everything they had, both guns and swords, at the 5 from Rogue Town. "Destroy the invaders!" A huge guy, easily 10 feet tall, roared. He charged ahead, swinging a massive mace that looked like it could crush a horse. Dalton dodged out of the way just in time. The mace slammed into the ground where he'd been standing. Seizing the opening, Dalton swung his iron halberd, aiming for the giant's head. The big guy was armored up, but Dalton's blow was powerful enough to shatter solid rock. There was a deafening crash, and Dalton himself was thrown back by the impact. "That's some tough armor," Dalton said, surprised. Heh, you didn't know. Our armor is made of Wapol metal. His Majesty Wapol wanted us soldiers to have the toughest gear possible so we could fight our hardest," the giant said proudly. "Wapol metal?" Dalton and Rogue both looked concerned. Armor made of Wapol metal? This was going to be a pain. "These guys are a problem," Sanji said, jumping forward. He zeroed in on an enemy with a rapier and unleashed a flurry of third-grade ground meat. The guy was sent flying by a level 3 grind kick, but thanks to the Wapol metal armor, he wasn't even scratched. Another enemy, wielding a knight's lance, charged at Zoro. Zoro leaped into the air, aiming for the guy's neck and going for a 3-hit combo. Sparks flew, but the armor around the guy's neck held. Zoro landed and glared at his opponent. Not as easy as I thought, he muttered. Even with the Wado Ikemanji, Sandai Kitetsu, and Yubashiri, his blades couldn't pierce the armor, and he was aiming for the relatively weak spot at the neck. Whoa, a bunch of armored dudes, Luffy exclaimed, bouncing into the air and throwing punches. Goma Goma no Gatling. Luffy unleashed a barrage of hundreds of fists on several enemies, but the punches just bounced off the Wapol metal armor. They made an impact, sure, but didn't do any real damage. Rogue, still in his cactus power armor, had recovered a bit. Seeing how hard it was to break through these guys' defenses, he decided to test their weaknesses. Take this. Rogue jumped, putting everything he had into a punch aimed at a giant swinging a meteor hammer. The blow made the metal sing. The giant was blasted back 30 feet. Phew, finally. Rogue said, catching his breath, but the giant just got back up. The attack clearly hadn't finished him off. This isn't going to work, Rogue frowned. These guys were tough, mainly because of their high defense Wapol metal armor, swords, fists. Nothing seemed to hurt them, but there had to be a way. Don't sweat it, guys, I've got an idea, Rogue announced confidently. Sanji, Dalton, Zoro, and Luffy all stared at him, curious. Watch this. Rogue dashed toward an enemy armed with a knight's lance. The guy tried to stab Rogue, but Rogue was too quick. He dodged, grabbed the guy, and tossed him off the mountainside. The scream echoed as the enemy plummeted from the 16,000-foot peak. Falling from that height, there was no way he was surviving. Rogue turned back to the remaining enemies. They seemed to be motivated by fear or something. They backed away. See? Just toss him off the mountain. Avoids all the boring fighting, right? Rogue said, if these guys were too hard to damage, with their crazy high defense, just get rid of them another way. That's genius. Saves a ton of effort, Sanji said, grinning. He cracked his knuckles, ready to go wild. If he couldn't hurt them, he could still boot them off the edge. That method's definitely less of a hassle, Zoro agreed happily. He sheathed two of his swords, gripping the Wado Ikemanji tightly. He knew he didn't need to kill them, just knock them into the air. Luffy jumped up and down. Whoa, like a slingshot game. Bouncing enemies away was right up his alley. Dalton swung his iron halberd, and his body began to transform rapidly. He went from human to something more. He became even bigger. His nose morphed into something resembling a bull's snout, and horns sprouted from his head. Dalton was a user of the Oxox fruit, a zoan-type devil fruit. He could transform between human, animal, and hybrid forms. Now, he was a minotaur. The minotaur, wielding an iron halberd, could carry a ton. Rogue, Sanji, and the enemies were speechless. So cool. Luffy shouted. He's gotten stronger, Sanji observed. What a beast, Zoro said, squinting. Dalton, as loyal as an ox. This form suits you, Rogue said. Now that they knew the plan, the five from Rogue Town eyed their opponents. Alright, let's send these guys tumbling, Rogue said. Yeah. Let's do this. The five charged at the Wapol guards. Rogue swung, connecting with an enemy carrying a sword and shield. The guy went flying backward, tumbling down the mountainside. Okay, that's how it's done. Rogue punched, kicked, and grappled, throwing enemies off one by one. Sanji kicked a rushing enemy wielding a giant axe, then followed up with a side kick to another. Enemies went flying off the mountain at Sanji's feet. An enemy with dual swords rushed at Zoro. Zoro dodged and struck from the side. One sword style, mountain shake. Zoro's strike sent the guy sailing off the edge. Even if the blade couldn't cut them, the force of the blow could knock them off their feet. Luffy was in his element, stretching his body like rubber. He used enemies as projectiles, launching them down the mountain like a slingshot. Dalton was the MVP. With a personal vendetta against Wapol, he was unstoppable. Hiya! The Minotaur swung his halberd, sending enemies flying. He was a rampaging bull, mowing down the competition. Chapter 91. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dalton swung the iron halberd, his hatred for Wapol and his army burning bright. Screams echoed as they wiped out the enemy forces on the mountaintop. After a brutal fight, they'd sent dozens of soldiers tumbling down the mountainside. Now that's what I call a battle. Rog boomed, clapping his hands. Luffy stretched, unimpressed. could have been better. Meanwhile, inside Wapol's gaudy golden palace, the king watched the carnage unfold from a window. These guys are insane. Wapol gasped. His elite guards had been taken down with embarrassing ease by Rog and his crew. Their strength scared him, he saw their grim faces, and the sight only fueled the tyrant's twisted nature, making his expression even more menacing. Wapol's face turned sour, and the faces of his advisors mirrored his own. Your Majesty, we need to seal the palace gates. Use the palace itself as our defense. Prime Minister Cromeraman blurted out, desperate. In the tense atmosphere, he was the only one who dared speak up. Wapol shot him a glance. Fine. Cromeraman barked orders. Everyone, inside the palace. No more fighting outside. Activate the palace defenses. He and the other ministers scrambled to comply. Wapol turned away from the window and slumped back onto his throne, seething. He couldn't believe anyone had managed to climb his 16,000-foot mountain, and with that kind of power. Jess and the others said these pirates were tough fighters, and they weren't kidding. Wapol muttered, remembering Jess. He grabbed the specially designed transponder snail. Jess! Wapol yelled into it. Your Majesty, I've reached the base of the central mountain, Jess reported. Good. Get up here and defend the palace. Yes, sir. Wapol hung up, relieved. As long as this palace holds, I'm safe. Reinforcements are on the way, he reassured himself. Led by Cromeraman, the remaining guards and ministers hurried to seal every door and window of the palace. Built of gold and steel, the palace was designed to be an impenetrable fortress, immune even to tunneling. The foundations were solid gold and steel. Outside, Rog and his crew had finished off the remaining guards, or rather, launched them off the mountain. The palace doors slammed shut. Crap, they sealed the palace, Rog said. Time to open it, then. Luffy charged towards the main gate and unleashed a flurry of punches, hammering the metal dozens of times. His final Gum siege barrage slammed into the gate, but the only result was a brief metallic shudder. The door remained unscathed. Ouch, ouch, that hurt. Luffy yelped, hopping around. Zoro rolled his eyes, then approached the gate. He tested it with his swords, but they barely left a scratch. Tough, Zoro admitted. Sanji surveyed the palace, now a closed fortress. Damn, not a single opening, Sanji observed. Well, Rog asked Dalton, are there any entrances to this palace besides the doors and windows? No, that's it. I used to work in the old palace before I rebelled against Wapol. At that time, the palace used by the old king had not been dismantled. Later, soon after Wapol came to the throne, he vigorously developed industries and gained wealth. Because he was in conflict with his tyranny, he left the palace. Then he built this golden palace, Dalton said. Dalton stared at the golden palace, his expression filled with disgust. Wapol only respected strength and money. The Wapol army represented force, and the golden palace represented money. As they pondered their next move, a fleet of hot air balloons appeared overhead. More than a dozen of them floated towards the mountaintop. Each balloon was over 50 feet in diameter, with a 30-foot-long pod dangling beneath. You won't lay a hand on His Majesty Wapol. The threat blared from loudspeakers mounted on the balloons. A large contingent of the king's army had arrived to reinforce the palace from the air. Rog and his team looked up at the balloons, their faces grim. Didn't expect Wapol to have an air force, Sanji said, surprised. Dalton frowned. My men mentioned that Wapol bought a bunch of these hot air balloon weapons from Drexus. The balloons were made of specially treated composite materials and leather, reinforced with fiber and wire, designed to withstand the harsh conditions at high altitudes. The gondolas below could carry soldiers, machine guns, and artillery. Inside one of the gondolas, a colonel and 20 soldiers prepared for battle. The colonel, also the commander of the balloon unit, declared, "Good thing we got here. His Majesty Wapol's palace is secured. Now we just need to wipe out the enemy." "What about Commander Jess?" an adjutant asked. "Tell him we've reached the summit and the palace has been sealed," the colonel ordered. "Yes, sir." The colonel peered out the gondola window towards the summit. These hot air balloons from Drexus were also known as air combat fortresses. the Drexus arms dealer had given this scientific name to this weapon. Air combat fortresses were built to operate at altitudes of several thousand meters. They used a special fuel machine. The fuel machine provided hot air for the balloon and power to the propeller. The air combat fortress could carry 20 soldiers, and it was equipped with 2 large-caliber artillery and multiple machine guns. The air combat fortress was not very big, but it had powerful combat effectiveness. Chapter 92 Attack and Defense at the Top of the Mountain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The aerial fortress surrounded the 5 from their position atop the 16,000-foot mountain. Inside the Golden Palace, Wapol got word from his guards that reinforcements were on the way in the form of a huge hot air balloon squadron. Sitting on his throne, Wapol was overjoyed. "This is the best news ever," he declared, preening in his red robe and crown. "Your Majesty, in that case, we simply need to hold this palace and wait for our forces to crush the enemy," Cromaraman said. The Prime Minister and Cromaraman stood before the throne on the red carpet, looking up at Wapol with reverence. "Yes, Your Majesty, we're saved. The hot air balloon force is more than enough to wipe them out. After all, the enemy is just a bunch of traitors and foreign pirates. They can't possibly stand against your supreme power. Long live His Majesty Wapol. You will lead us to destroy all the villains and make the Drum Kingdom the most powerful kingdom in the world." The ministers chimed in, their flattery flowing freely. Their earlier anxieties had vanished, replaced by elation, matching Wapol's buoyant mood. They were eager to curry favor. Wapol said proudly, "All right, everyone. Let's have some delicious food and wine brought in to celebrate. We'll wait here for the good news from our army." He gave the order, and palace staff hurried to comply. Soon, the imperial chefs had prepared a feast, which the waiters promptly began to serve. Though it was a hall for state affairs, tables and chairs were quickly arranged so the ministers could enjoy the food and wine with Wapol. Platters piled high with meat, fish, shrimp, salads, and fruit were set out, along with an array of expensive wines. A 10-foot wide round table was placed before Wapol. The waiters brought in the food. "Oh, roast turkey. My favorite." Wapol grabbed a knife and fork, plunging them into a golden turkey at the center of the round table and shoving a huge bite into his mouth. The ministers and waiters watched, maintaining forced composure. Wapol's eating habits were grotesque and repulsive, but no one dared say a word. "What are you waiting for? Dig in," Wapol said. After swallowing, Cromaraman smoothly stepped in to defuse the situation. "Your Majesty, you are a king. We all admire your awe-inspiring way of eating. Even when you eat, you inspire awe. You show great attention to detail. You are truly the world's greatest king." Cromaraman gushed. "Ah." Wapol stared at Cromaraman, his eyes unreadable. The other ministers held their breaths. "Ha ha 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 ha." Wapol erupted in laughter, shaking the hall. "All right, Cromaraman. You truly are my most loyal servant." "Well said." Wapol praised. "Thank you for your compliment, Your Majesty," Cromaraman replied. He picked up a steak and began to eat, but unlike Wapol, he subtly inquired about the situation outside the palace from the other ministers and guards. Wapol continued to gorge himself. "Roast suckling pig. I love it." Wapol stuffed another tender piglet into his mouth. A waiter carefully removed the finished plates and brought in fresh delicacies. Wapol's mood was complex, and he seemed ready to devour anything. While the feast was underway in the Golden Palace, the battle intensified at the mountain's peak. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, Luffy, and Dalton were surrounded by over a dozen aerial fortresses. These fortresses were commanded by skilled officers who maintained their distance. "Attention all aerial fortresses, maintain your distance. Avoid close combat," ordered the colonel in charge of the hot air balloon unit. The order was transmitted to all the fortresses via Den Den Mushi. The aerial fortresses kept their distance from the mountaintop, the closest being about 400 meters away. This distance was too great even for Luffy to reach. Gum gum. Remote grappling hook. Luffy stretched his arms hundreds of feet, but they fell short. "Damn it, these guys are annoying," Zoro said, feeling frustrated. The enemy had learned their lesson and no longer allowed themselves to get close. Dalton, studying the aerial fortresses, said, "Hot air balloon troops, formidable foes. What are we going to do?" Rog asked, his eyes fixed on the fortresses. The enemy now knew the risks of close combat. Even with the fortresses, their strategy was simply to keep their distance. As Rog and the others racked their brains, the colonel commanding the hot air balloon unit gave a new order. "All aerial fortresses, commence artillery bombardment." Immediately, the 16 aerial fortresses aimed their 50-centimeter cannons at Rog's position. The artillery roared to life, unleashing a barrage of shells. Spherical shells rained down. Luffy quickly used his gum-gum balloon technique, but when a shell struck him, a violent explosion erupted. Whoa! The shell detonated on impact, sending Luffy flying. These were special shells designed to explode on contact. What the? Sanji raised his foot to kick a shell back but quickly retracted it, letting it fly past. Zoro didn't dare to try to slice the shells with his swords. Instead, he used his double sword technique. Eagle Wave. Zoro unleashed 2 streams of sword energy, intercepting and detonating 2 of the shells. Seeing this, Rog quickly drew his thorn whip. He activated his devil fruit power. Green light enveloped the whip, and it began to grow rapidly. Thorn whip. Sky net. The whip quickly formed a net 10 meters wide, shielding the group. A dozen shells slammed into the net, exploding violently. When the smoke cleared, only a few strands of the whip remained. "These shells are tough. Guess it's all up to you, Rog," Sanji said. The others took a breath, knowing they couldn't sustain this indefinitely. Each time Rog blocked a volley, he had to use his devil fruit power to create another net of thorns, draining his energy. Creating those 16,000-foot vines had already pushed him to his limit. "This can't go on. We have to find a way," Dalton said, scanning the surroundings. Finally, his eyes landed on the great fort at the summit. Chapter 93 The Sound of Cannons on the Top of the Mountain. You are listening at novelfull.audio. There are 6 massive forts on the mountaintop, each equipped with long-range mortars made by Drexus. "Maybe we can put these weapons to good use," Dalton suggested. Sanji glanced toward the nearest fort. Dalton took off running, and Sanji followed right behind. They reached the top of the 3-story fort, where a 10-meter-long mortar, 1 meter in diameter, stood ready. "That's one huge cannon. How do we even work this thing?" Sanji wondered. Dalton examined the cannon closely. "Even though it's massive, we can still manage. Old as it is, it should still work." Sanji joined in, running his hands over the cannon. The 10-meter long-range cannon had mechanical wheels to adjust both height and direction. Dalton noticed 2 wheels on the left side. One controlled the horizontal aiming, the other the vertical. There was also a long-range targeting device, but it only worked for enemies thousands of meters away. For the hot air balloons, they could just aim directly. Sanji located 20 huge cannonballs, 1 meter in diameter, stacked nearby. "Dalton, give it a shot," Sanji said. "All right," Dalton replied. Dalton quickly started adjusting the cannon with the tilting wheel. The cannon's mechanics were surprisingly sophisticated. The horizontal and vertical wheels were linked to levers and mechanical bearings. Plus, Dalton, transformed into his minotaur-like beast form, could control the cannon with ease. The massive long-range mortar, a Drexus design, swung around and aimed at an aerial combat fortress. Sanji opened the chamber cover at the base of the cannon and kicked a huge black shell inside. "Okay, fire!" Sanji yelled. "Roger that." Dalton pressed the handle switch, and the cannon roared to life. The 1-meter diameter shell hurtled toward the targeted air combat fortress. The explosion was deafening. The fortress instantly turned into a fireball, with flames and debris raining down. The shell had hit the pod beneath the hot air balloon, shattering it and tearing the balloon itself apart from the shockwave. With the air combat fortress destroyed, the other balloons ceased their attack. The colonel in charge of the hot air balloon unit watched his own fortress explode from his command chair. "They're using the mountaintop cannons against us," the colonel exclaimed in shock. Having successfully destroyed the first air-mobile fortress, Dalton and Sanji targeted the next. Sanji reloaded quickly, and Dalton fired another shot, obliterating the second fortress. Meanwhile, Rog, Zoro, and Luffy, observing from the mountaintop, were impressed by Dalton and Sanji's skill. "Whoa! That's awesome," Luffy cheered. They've got a good plan, Zoro commented. Yeah, they're doing great, Roger agreed. Let's get in on this. Zoro suggested. Zoro, and Luffy raced to another hilltop fort. There, they took control of a long-range cannon and aimed at another air-mobile fortress. What a rush, Roger exclaimed after firing a shot himself. Working together, Rog and Dalton's crews shot down 7 air-mobile fortresses in quick succession. The enemy, suffering heavy losses, began to pull back. The colonel, commanding from his air-mobile fortress, was enraged. Damn it! They're turning our own weapons against us. The colonel raged. Now he only had 9 air-mobile fortresses left. Worse, the long-range mortars on the mountaintop had a range of thousands of meters. His aerial mobile fortresses had nowhere to hide. Colonel, give the order. We can't stay here. Those cannons will wipe us out. An adjutant pleaded. The colonel was on the verge of losing it. They were supposed to be rescuing Wapol's palace from a siege. Even if he escaped, he'd face a death sentence. If we're doomed anyway, we might as well go down fighting. The colonel finally declared. Immediately, every phone bug in the remaining fortresses crackled with the same order. All remaining aerial mobile fortresses, close in on the mountaintop. Attack the 6 forts with everything we've got. Following the order, the remaining air-mobile fortresses began to shorten the distance again. The 2 main guns in the pod beneath each fortress swung around and targeted Rog's turret. They're coming back, Rog warned. Suddenly, a barrage of shells slammed into the fort, shaking the massive mortar. One shell struck the tin box where they were storing the cannonballs. Inside were a dozen huge shells, each a meter in diameter. Oh, crap! Zoro exclaimed in surprise. Rog, reacting instantly, grabbed Zoro and Luffy and dove for cover. Thanks to his cactus-powered armor, Rog was incredibly strong. The armor boosted his strength and defense. Even so, the force of the exploding cannonballs sent Rog flying. He slammed into Wapol's golden palace with a crash. Damn, that hurt. Rog groaned. Luffy and Zoro were both temporarily stunned. The fort where Dalton and Sanji were stationed was also hit by a volley of shells. The explosion sent them hurtling through the air. They crashed to the ground. The enemy shelling was relentless. Relying on the firepower of the mobile fortresses, all 6 forts were destroyed one by one. The advantage on the battlefield swung back to the hot air balloon troops. Rog, picking himself up, saw that the forts around the mountaintop had been reduced to rubble. The aerial mobile fortresses were widening the distance again. These guys are annoying, Sanji said, scrambling to his feet. Zoro, covered in snow, stood up again, sword in hand. Luffy, though, seemed to be acting strangely. What's going on? Why is it so cold up here? I can barely move. Luffy complained. Up here, on the 5,000-meter high mountain, Luffy's rubbery body was becoming brittle. Fortunately, his strong vitality meant he wouldn't be slowed down for long. Chapter 94 The Reinforced King #039, S Army. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Everyone's spirits sank, and they slipped back into passivity. 9 air combat fortresses kept up their bombardment from a distance. The 6 forts on the mountaintop were now rubble, leaving Rog and the others unable to mount an effective defense. The snow-covered peak was pockmarked with craters. Meanwhile, back at the base of the central peak, Jess and his elite troops had driven off Dalton's harassing forces. Jess stood there, gazing up at the 16,000-foot mountain, the swirling snow and the distant explosions. Things looked dicey up there. Jess glanced towards the pod platform. A supply pod had landed hard, snapping its iron chain. The fight at the top must have been brutal to wreck the chain like that. The crane mechanism was probably toast too. The only good news was that the hot air balloon squadron was already holding its own up there. Wapol's palace remained sealed tight. Jace knew Wapol's golden palace was built like a fortress. Not only could artillery barely scratch it, but it was stocked with enough supplies to last a month. Wapol could just hunker down in there, living the high life, and wait for his enemies to be wiped out. Jess's immediate problem was getting more reinforcements to the summit. He turned to the officers around him. All right, people, how do we get reinforcements up there? Jace asked. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The question hanging in the air was, how to support the troops on the summit. With the mountaintop lift system destroyed, landing an army up there was like trying to climb into the sky. "Commander Jess, I have an idea," said a bearded officer. "Let's hear it," Jess replied. "Remember those luxury hot air balloons Wapol used for sightseeing? They're practically flying mansions. We could use those to drop a large number of soldiers." Jess paused, then his eyes lit up. "Okay, let's use those hot air balloon villas." "Great, I'll contact the supply department ASAP. Have them send over Wapol's hot air balloon digs," the officer said. "And I want the whole army on standby. Have the hot air balloon squadron on the summit provide covering fire for our guys," Jess added. Soon, Wapol's old tourist traps came floating in, 8 hot air balloon villas, each with a diameter, floated to the base of the central peak. Wapol had commissioned these from a civilian company under the world government. A 3-story villa hung beneath a balloon with a diameter. The villas were lavishly built, retaining the basic shape of a villa but with a curved bottom, like a boat, and, of course, done up in Wapol's signature style, plated in gold. "Never thought we'd be using these for combat," Jess said, eyeing the enormous balloons. "Alright, we're on a tight schedule. Everyone, familiarize yourselves with the inside of these things and load them up with as many weapons and soldiers as possible," Jess commanded. "Yes, sir." The officers replied. Soldiers scrambled into the villas, loading weapons, each villa crammed in 90 soldiers, and then the 8 balloons began to lift off one by one. The villas rose slowly. While they could handle the altitude and cold, they were built for sightseeing, not speed. They were nowhere near as fast as Drexus's aerial mobile fortresses. Back on the mountaintop, Rog and his 4 companions were doing their best to evade the enemy's attacks. The 9 air mobile fortresses used their distance to their advantage, laying down heavy fire. Another barrage of explosions forced Rog and his group to scramble for cover. "This isn't working," Roger said, then his gaze fell on the Golden Palace. Even though it was sealed shut, they could still hide on top. "Listen up, everyone, I have an idea," Roger announced. Sanji, Dalton, and the others turned to him. "Let's hide on top of the palace," Rog said. They all took off toward the Golden Palace. The 5 of them reached the top, where they found a large platform. They collapsed, breathing hard, finally able to rest. "Ha, ha," Dalton panted, looking around in confusion. "What's going on?" "They've stopped attacking," Sanji said. "Could it be?" Sauron looked at the 9 air mobile fortresses. "Hey, they stopped!" Luffy exclaimed. Rog watched the 9 mobile air fortresses. Sure enough, once they were on the palace, the attack stopped, because it was Wapol's Golden Palace. Even the palaces couldn't damage it, and Wapol was inside. They wouldn't risk attacking. "I knew it, they won't dare attack," Rog said. "After all, this palace is where the big cheese, Wapol, hangs his hat. They wouldn't dare mess with it," Dalton said. "Alright, we can wait here. Now we just need to figure out how to crack this gold-plated can," Sanji said. But before they could celebrate, a fleet of hot air balloons, bigger than the air battle fortresses, floated into view, and beneath each balloon hung a 3-story villa. "What, a villa?" Sauron frowned. The massive size of these balloons made them rise even more slowly than the fortresses. The aerial battle forts flew over the peak, and then the villas dropped to the ground. The doors burst open, and heavily armed soldiers of the king's army poured out. They quickly set up machine guns and light artillery, ready for a fight. In total, 8 hot air balloon villas disgorged over soldiers. Then the hot air balloon villas began to rise slowly and leave the mountaintop. "So, more reinforcements," Rog said. "Looks like we're in for a fight," Dalton said. Once all the soldiers had disembarked, an officer began to speak through a loudspeaker. "Dalton and pirates, you're surrounded. Surrender now." Chapter 95 The 3 Rust Brothers. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The king's army tried to get Rog and the others to surrender via loudspeaker. Rog, Sanji, Dalton, Sauron, and Luffy all sized up the approaching army. "Those Wapol stooges," Dalton spat out. As the leader of the resistance, his hatred for Wapol ran deep. "Still trying to recruit us," Sauron scoffed. Rog watched the enemy, a smirk forming on his face. "They're so full of themselves. Let's give them a little surprise. How? Sanji asked. I've got an idea. Just wait and see. Rog pulled out a tomato. Tomatoes? What's so fun about that? Sanji asked, confused. Rog held the tomato in his hand, channeling his plant fruit ability. A green glow enveloped his palm, and the tomato started to grow, and grow. Soon, it was a massive 5 meters wide. Wow, I wanna eat it. Luffy exclaimed. Not for you. This is for them. Rog hurled the giant tomato at the king's army. The colossal tomato slammed into the officer who was shouting through the loudspeaker, flattening him and a bunch of soldiers around him. Tomato pulp and juice splattered everywhere, painting the battlefield red. How's that for a snack? Rog yelled. Hey, that's a waste of good food, Sanji grumbled, slightly annoyed. It's a weapon, not food. Get your priorities straight, Rog retorted. Sanji shut his mouth and shifted his stance, ready for a fight. The king's army was enraged. The officer, scrambling to his feet, yelled, full attack, that the army surged forward, a wave of soldiers heading straight for the palace. Alright, time to cut loose. Rog shouted, afraid of damaging Wapple's precious golden palace. They held back on artillery, charging with firearms instead. The front ranks had bayonets fixed. They swarmed up the palace steps on either side, aiming for the platform on top. That's where Rog and his crew were waiting. Charge! Take out Dalton and the pirates. Big rewards for everyone. The king's army surged forward, bayonets glinting. Rog charged, fists flying. Screams filled the air as Rog's punches sent a dozen enemies flying. Bayonets scraped against his armor, but only left superficial scratches. This guy's armor is insane. A soldier exclaimed in shock. Others opened fire, but the bullets were useless. Rog's cactus armor could withstand cannons, let alone small arms. Rog plowed through the left flank, scattering the first wave of attackers. The remaining soldiers were effectively blocked, unable to push past him. Dalton, wielding his halberd, helped fend off any stray enemies. A group of soldiers surrounded him. Dalton, you traitor, you can't escape now. An officer sneered. Yeah, daring to attack the central peak. You've got a death wish. Another soldier added. Let's run him through. A third yelled. The officer lunged with his saber, but Dalton parried with his halberd, sending the saber spinning out of his hand, flying 10 meters away. More soldiers swarmed in, thrusting with their bayonets. Dalton's eyes blazed like a bull. He crouched low, spinning his halberd in a wide arc, deflecting the bayonets with ease. The force of the spinning halberd ripped the rifles from the soldiers' hands. The king's army backed off, intimidated. Dalton was a force of nature, his presence radiating power. He's too strong. Get the pistols. That the soldiers quickly pulled out their pistols and opened fire on Dalton, but nothing happened. Dalton didn't fall, didn't even bleed. After transforming into his bull-like form, his thick fur easily absorbed the bullets. He's a monster. Bullets don't even work. A soldier cried. The soldiers were out of options. You lackeys of Wapple, eat this. Fueled by rage and raw power, Dalton swung his halberd, sending more soldiers flying, but there were too many enemies. More than 20 hulking soldiers slipped through the cracks, armed with massive axes. Looks like the heavy hitters are here, and they're coming for me, Dalton observed. The axe-wielding giants surrounded him. Traitor Dalton, your head is ours. They roared. Dalton's transformed appearance was similar to a minotaur, standing close to 3 meters tall. These axe-wielding soldiers matched him in size and build. Wapple's got deep pockets. Must have paid a fortune to hire you foreign mercenaries. Who are you guys? Dalton inquired. The giants exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward. Yeah, we're the notorious thug mercenary group. Looks like your luck ran out today. You and the resistance always playing guerrilla warfare, making it impossible to get you bastards. Another said. So guys, kill him. Another roared. Dalton studied the three giants who had spoken. They looked almost identical. "Are you three brothers?" he asked. "Yes, we are the Rust brothers, leaders of the thug mercenary group, the Cash Drum Country's elite axe squad." They answered in unison. "All right, enough talk then," Dalton said, and charged at one of them, swinging his halberd. One of the Rust brothers swung his giant axe, meeting Dalton's halberd with a resounding crash. Although he blocked the attack, he felt Dalton's incredible strength. "Damn!" The Rust brother stumbled back a few steps. "Not bad, you've got some power too. I am a warrior who once knocked down a house." Dalton said. Dalton had the edge, stronger and more skilled. The three Rust brothers and the surrounding axe squad were shocked. "Brother, stop messing around. Let's take him down together." The three brothers quickly circled Dalton, trapping him. Dalton felt the change. Their combined presence made them significantly stronger. Fighting them separately is impossible, and now fighting them together. Chapter 96 Rampage. Dalton. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With a terrifying battle aura, the three Ruster brothers surrounded Dalton. "Dalton, you're going down." They roared in unison, swinging their massive axes. Dalton felt a wave of deadly energy rolling off their weapons. Even his thick hide prickled from the sheer force. "Whoa!" he shouted, leaping nearly 20 feet into the air. The three axes slammed into the spot where he'd been standing, pulverizing the gold bricks. This wasn't just any gold, it was palace-grade, practically cannon-proof. "Serious destructive power," Dalton muttered, landing hard. The three brothers glared, hefting their axes. "Not bad for a freak like you," the eldest sneered. Dalton eyed them. "You guys are pretty tough too, huh? Guess I gotta step it up." They raised their axes again, charging like lions. The wind howled as the blades whistled down. At the last second, Dalton dodged, darting to their right. The guy on the end twisted, swinging his axe. Dalton blocked with his halberd, sparks flying in a deafening clang. Seizing his chance, Dalton followed through, slashing the guy across the waist. Blood and gore exploded as the guy was cut open. "Second brother! Second brother!" The remaining brothers roared, their rage shaking the very foundations. Dalton backpedaled, knowing he'd just evened the odds. "You're gonna pay," the eldest snarled. "I'll make sure you don't get a decent burial." "We'll kill you," roared the youngest. The eldest and the youngest charged, flanking him from the left and right. Dalton went ballistic, whirling his halberd and slamming it into the youngest's path. He leaped, bringing the halberd down on the guy's head. With a sickening thud, the youngest's head was separated from his shoulders. The still swinging axe flew from his lifeless hand. Dalton crashed to the ground. "Phew, that's two," he grunted, planting his halberd for support. The remaining Ruster brother went completely berserk. "Three brothers," his voice was lost in the din of battle, his face contorted with hate. He'd watched his brothers fall one by one. All that was left was to turn Dalton into minced meat. "Get him, all of you!" The eldest roared at his men, the axe squad. They'd thought the brothers had it in the bag. Dalton's rampage had them frozen in fear. But a direct order from their captain snapped them back to reality, and they charged. "Kill!" 20+ berserkers barreled forward. Dalton hefted his halberd and shifted. His human beast form twisted into something more primal. Finally, he dropped to all fours. A 4-meter-long black bull, he tore into the axe squad, a whirlwind of fury. The soldiers hadn't even gotten close when they were tossed into the air. Dalton, a wrecking ball of muscle and horn, sent them flying. The entire axe squad was trampled and eliminated. The last Ruster brother was shocked and enraged. "Dalton is a real pain. My second and third brothers, my best men, and I can't beat him." With the axe squad gone, the last Ruster brother charged. He raised his axe, but Dalton roared to meet him, gathering all his strength. Dalton lowered his head. His final charge had enough force to knock down a house, ending with two massive horns. The giant axe in the hands of the boss of the Rust brothers was knocked flying, and two horns pierced through his chest. He flew off the platform at the top of the palace. Dalton finally skidded to a halt. Though the battlefield was a mess, Dalton's power was obvious. "Nice one, Dalton!" Rog shouted, dodging an attack and admiring the display of strength. Sanji, busy kicking the enemy, glanced over. That's power surpassing dinosaurs. It's good to have him on our side, Zoro added. Dalton, you're awesome. Luffy yelled, waving his arms. Dalton, still in yak form, couldn't help but grin. Let's smash these Wapple goons. Yeah. Rog, Sanji, Zoro, and Luffy roared. Rog and Dalton weren't the only ones putting on a show. Sanji was teaching the king's army a lesson. He launched a line of men with his kicks. Aim, an officer led 20 soldiers, leveling their rifles. Fire, a hail of bullets streamed toward Sanji. He bent backward, almost lying down. Then, he snapped upright, leaping into the air. He landed on the heads of the king's army, kicking them with a flurry of legs. A sortie. Sanji's feet violently kicked the bodies of these king's soldiers. The king's army screamed before falling to the ground and groaning. The officer was the last to fall, kicked into oblivion. How boring, Sanji said. Is it really boring? A cold voice sliced through the air. Sanji glanced to his right, seeing a slender man standing nearby.